I'm back again for round two. Welcome into In Touch with Indiana Sports, episode 2, powered by Hoosier Illustrated. Happy Friday, if it is indeed Friday that you are consuming this show. Welcome back for those of you who are back after the first episode. You being back means that I didn't do a bad enough job to scare you away. So I'm happy to have you along once again. Again, powered by Hoosier Illustrated. Thanks to Alec and Kyler, as always. And once again, for giving me the chance to do this. This is going to be a media day heavy type of a show. And I'm referring to Big Ten football media days, of course. They took place this week in Indianapolis at Lucas Oil Stadium. Earlier, I had a conversation with good friend Shannon Griffith to talk a little bit about what went down yesterday, specifically with Indiana. We also talked about the Big Ten as a whole. So we'll get to that here momentarily. I'll let you in on that conversation and all the things we talked about. Good conversation. Really good dude, Shannon Griffith. Former head coach. I think he most recently was at Ball State as an assistant. But really good dude. Knows his football. Had his son play for the Indiana Hoosiers not too long ago. And it's just good talking to him, catching up with him, and hearing his thoughts on the Indiana football program and where they're heading under first-year head coach Curt Cignetti. Man, yeah, it's Friday. Last night was Thursday, obviously, and I played in my high school alumni soccer game. So for those of you who don't know, I did play soccer in high school. And I know a lot of people probably, especially if you're older and you're watching the show, maybe you never played soccer, maybe you don't really watch soccer, and obviously that's totally fine. I'm very aware of the lack of popularity of soccer in this country. And I know it's been gaining popularity over the course of the last several years, but I know in the grand scheme of things, it's not number one, number two, or even number 3 or number 4 in terms of the sports that are mostly consumed in the United States. But nonetheless, I played in my 4th annual high school in my soccer game, and man, I am beat. I am nowhere near in athletic shape in any way, shape, or form. It was obviously some awesome exercise, and it felt good after the fact, knowing I was kind of getting the endorphins rolling, that type of a thing. But man, I was feeling it this morning trying to get out of bed. And it's one of those things where, whenever you're not used to doing that, it can, you'll feel a little sore. And I'm not sore like all over my body. I'm more so just like I feel like I need more rest. But nonetheless, I'm here. I've got my coffee, as always. I'm on my 2nd cup. I'm recording this around 10 o'clock. I did my segment with Shannon Griffith. I recorded that one of the first things I did when I got up this morning because I wanted to make sure I could get him when he was available. So, yeah, I've been up for a little bit. But, hey, we're rolling. We're getting things going here on a Friday. And also, I remember mentioning on Wednesday that I was going to try to get Jeffrey the Greek. And I knew I jumped the gun on that. I knew I shouldn't have said, hey, I've got this guy coming on Friday when I hadn't officially confirmed that. So lesson learned. But he is going to join us in the future when we get closer to football season, when his schedule frees up. And again, for those who may have missed it, Jeffrey the Greek, he's somebody who keeps up with the Big Ten in a way that I've never really seen outside of the people who, are on the Big Ten network. They, outside of those who professionally cover the conference. Whereas this guy, he's just a fan. He's a former Iowa football player, but he just loves college football and specifically the Big Ten conference. And so he keeps up with all sorts of stuff. He's got his own podcast as well, Eyes on Big. He's been doing that with a number of other guys, a big cast of characters that kind of rotates in and out of that show. And they've been doing that for, I believe, 4 or 5 years now. And he can correct me if I'm wrong whenever he comes on with us. So, yeah, Big Ten football media days. That's it's talking season, as it's also referred to sometimes. And Curt Cignetti, man, he did exactly what I kind of predicted he would do, and that is steal the show during his day, which was the final day on Thursday. And he gets behind, I said this on Twitter yesterday, he holds court when he gets behind a microphone. He's not afraid of the mic. He came up, and I think it seemed like he had something prepared to say. He had something written down, And he went by that in the initial going. But once he got maybe 30 seconds to a minute into his opening statement, everything from there was, I guess, off the cuff is the best way to say it. He had plenty of things he wanted to say, and Shannon Griffith and I kind of get more into that. So I won't talk too much about it. I'm also going to play some sound, some interesting things that he said yesterday after I play his segment, because he has no filter. He even said this during one of the roundtable sessions yesterday, that he is not afraid to just say what's on his mind. And he said that kind of comes with age, and I think that's pretty accurate when you're thinking about people who have a lot of life experience, and they just kind of learn that they don't care who they offend. And I don't think Cignetti's trying to offend anybody. That's not what I'm saying, but they just don't care what they say, because they feel that the most genuine thing is to be yourself, and I think that's 100% the truth. So we'll get into a lot of that here in a little bit. And then we also heard from the players, 3 players who were there yesterday: Mike Kadick, Justice Ellison, and here's the thing. Why is it so easy to blank on the last name? Or whenever you're trying to name off a series of stuff, it seems like no matter what it is, no matter who you are as a human being, you can name, if you've got 5 things, you can name the first 4. If you've got 8 things, you can name the first 7. Or in my case, if you got 3 things, you can name the first 2. What is it about our brains that whenever we're trying to name off a list of stuff, why is it so hard to always remember that final thing? So maybe we can try that again here. Mike Kadick, offensive lineman, came along yesterday. We'll hear from him. Aiden Fisher, I believe that's the one I forgot the first time around. And then Justice Ellison. They all talked to the media, and there's some interesting stuff, some funny things as well that we'll play here throughout the show and react to as well. Another thing I'm going to talk about, Deshaun Foster, the new head coach at UCLA. He kind of, and this is maybe being, I don't want to oversell it, but he kind of had a bit of a meltdown, or at least he kind of froze up. He during his opening statement for UCLA, or when he got up to the podium to speak for UCLA, he kind of, not even kind of, he was a little embarrassing for himself. He seemed unprepared, and I'll tell you what, I've been there. And when we get to that part in the show, I'll kind of tell my experience with being unprepared for a presentation and how I feel for him as a human being, but I don't feel bad for him as the head coach of UCLA. So we'll get into that as well. What else? BTN tailgate coming to Indiana versus Maryland later on in the season. So for those who don't know, BTN tailgate is the Big Ten Network's version of College Game Day. Really, all these networks kind of have their own version of that now. Obviously, you got Big Noon Kickoff on Fox. You've also got, I think the SEC Network has their own version of it as well. I don't know what the name of theirs is off the top of my head, but that game for Indiana versus Maryland falls in week 5. And when we went over the schedule yesterday, or on Wednesday, I should say, I was talking about the opportunity that lies in the early going for Indiana to get off to a hot start if things pan out in their favor. Because in week 1, you've got FIU. Week 2, you've got Western Illinois, and so on. You got UCLA on the road. We've talked about that being kind of the barometer game on figuring out where this team really is. Then you've got Charlotte, and then after that is the Maryland game. And I believe that was placed, or selected, I should say, by the Big Ten Network on purpose, because, and I haven't looked at Maryland's schedule specifically, but if one thing that these network shows like to do whenever they're picking these games, especially if they're picking them ahead of time, they like to try to predict what's going to be an intriguing matchup for that week, and if teams have momentum and that type of a thing. Now, I know it's different with College Game Day. They pick that week to week because they want to have the absolute best matchup of the week if they can. But it's also a little bit different nowadays, too, because you have the network affiliations. You have ESPN, who primarily is partnered with the SEC and the ACC. You have Fox and those networks, which are primarily partnered with the Big Ten, formerly the Pac-12. The Big 12 doesn't have, I think they do have an affiliation with the ESPN. It's not as lucrative or as binding as the SEC or the SE or the ACC. But yeah, that's maybe nerding out a little too much on network affiliation, but that's one thing Indiana's got to look forward to later on in the season. Hopefully things are going in their favor, so there could be a little extra hype going into that week, because if you've never seen one of those shows, like you like to see a big crowd in the background. So yeah, BT and Tailgate coming to Bloomington versus Maryland. We'll talk more about that, obviously, as we get closer to that week. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get into this segment that I recorded with Shannon Griffith. We talk a lot about his perspective from media days, really his thoughts on the Indiana football program and the direction they're heading as a whole. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get that segment rolling right here. Joining me now from Hoosier Tailgate is the one, the only Shannon Griffith. Good morning, sir. How's it going?
Good, Johnny. I'm doing good and got a good night's sleep after a long couple days.
Good to talk to you again. I tell you what, I played in an alumni high school soccer game last night at my high school, Bullies, down here in Kentucky. And as somebody who is not very active athletically anymore, I'm feeling it this morning, to say the least. I enjoyed my time, but I'll say it was a little tough getting out of bed today.
Well, I'll just tell you this: the older you get, the worse it gets. So,
and that's the thing. There were guys there who were in their upper 30s. I'm in my mid 20s right now, but there were people of all ages that graduated. But I do always worry. This is the third year that I've played in this, and every year I feel like I get more and more exhausted playing in this alumni event.
I can imagine. Of course, I haven't been the guru of fitness, I guess you could say, for the latter part of my 30s through my 50s now. So with 5 back surgeries and a knee replacement and one coming, I think my days in alumni anything are over.
Everybody has a wall, right? You were up at Big Ten football media days for really all week, and mainly covering Indiana. But what was kind of your overall takeaway of everything that took place? Not necessarily from the Hoosiers' perspective at first, but what was kind of the biggest talking point as a whole for the conference, you feel like?
Well, it was a unique experience for me, being that I'm usually the one on the opposite side of media days, where, talking about a specific team, my team, or when I was at Ball State talking about my position group. So it was a unique experience being on the other side of the coin, so to speak. The Big Ten does a great job putting on a very, very big event, especially when you expanded it by 4 teams this year, and they're coming in for the West Coast and all the media and things of that nature. But I think one of the unique things is Oregon took blew up a big Oregon duck,
the inflatable duck, yeah,
and placed it in the White River and kind of stuck their claim into the Big Ten with that floating down the White River. So I thought that was a unique introduction to the Big Ten for Oregon that people will not forget. So I think that did its stated purpose and created a memory that people will always recall because of how they did it. And Oregon's always been known to be a very good brand and marketing entity out there, and with Phil Knight and everything. So, but that was the unique thing. I thought, learning about some of the new technology that's coming into play this year, not just the helmet communication, but the sideline video that is coming into play now, because they're going to have everything basically that the NFL has, from a 18 total iPads, and probably 14 of them will be on the field. So after every series, offensive linemen and the offensive line coach can go through the previous series of plays. So learning about some of that unique stuff, I think, is always intriguing, because you see in the advancement of college football, because college football has lacked behind the technology advancement that we've seen, and they're still behind in some things, but they're catching up.
And it does seem like overall, from being as far behind as they were on the technology side, it seems like it's a pretty big leap forward all in one year. Not only that, but you have all the changes coming to the game itself, especially when you talk about the added teams of the conference, the expanded playoff, all that type of stuff. It seems like it's not going to be a whole new college football with the game itself, but
Right.
it is going to kind of usher in a new era in more than one way.
Yeah, it's going to be a big adjustment slash jump this year in the Big Ten alone. You talk about travel and how that may or may not impact the teams. Midwest teams going out west, West teams coming out to the Midwest or the East Coast for that matter. And how all that will have its impact. Nobody knows because it's never been done in terms of a conference schedule. But yeah, you're right in the sense that college football as a whole, I think lacked behind the technology advancements that we've seen throughout the NFL. I was talking to one of the entities there that's in charge of it, DV Sport, and we were talking about how the NFL, if you want to get the all 22 copy of a NFL team, if you subscribe to the NFL Pass, you can get any game that's played on a Sunday and get a sideline view and an end zone view of that game. In college football, it's you're lucky to get anything video wise because they lock it down like Fort Knox. But there's a missed opportunity not only for them to advance the game, but also pick up some pocket change by adding subscriptions to it. I mean, that's the world we live in nowadays. Everything's a subscription. I mean, you look at Peacock and NBC, by placing games on that streaming app. If you want to watch games, you're going to have to buy a subscription. So those are all the things that are coming to the forefront that I thought were unique and interesting of the day. And then, of course, I think you alluded to it too, is the fact that we've got 4 new teams, 4 different personalities. So that was, an interesting dynamic for the media day.
And I feel like with them specifically, you hit on the scheduling concerns. I think we're going to see, not even just with those 4 teams, but when you think about Cal and Stanford being in the ACC, and they're the only 2 teams on the West Coast in that conference. So they can only travel to each other and not have to worry about long flights, that type of stuff, the jet lag potentially. And I think you're going to see more often than not that be in effect, especially in this first year of this new transition. I mean, yeah, they may come out and win some games. It may be ugly doing it, but I think you're going to see a lot of, especially the further you get into the season, you're going to see a lot more issues come up with the travel.
Well, the one thing with football that's nice though is that for the most part, when you get into the conference season, it is a Saturday game, and for the most part, what day you're going to travel on, and everything of those things are already sorted out. I think a lot of teams are talking about going out on a Thursday after a practice they have on campus and getting out to the West Coast and get acclimated a full day prior to a game. It'll be interesting to see if the Midwest team has to go out to the West Coast and play a night game.
Yeah.
You think about it. If you have a 7-8 o'clock kickoff in LA at USC, you're talking 10, 11 o'clock back on the East Coast or Midwest.
And Indiana got lucky this year in that regard. They play UCLA in week 3. That's their only West Coast road trip. I believe in terms of Eastern time, that game won't kick off until 7:30, 4:30 Pacific, something like that. And so thankfully from the Indiana perspective, if you're one of the players or the coaches on that team, you may not experience the worst of that. Whereas if you are playing one of those Pac-12 after dark style of games, it's going to be a whole different story.
Right. And I think I think Penn State may have the most mileage for travel to games this year.
Wow.
So that'll be an interesting dynamic to see what happens there. But I think they laid out the schedule that, one, you don't have multiple times where you're going back to the West Coast for 2 games, back-to-back weeks.
Yeah.
and vice versa for the West Coast teams, because I think they've done a pretty good job of at least toning that down or seeing that there could be a disadvantage for a team. So I overall, I thought they did, the Big Ten did a great job as it pertains to the organization and the timely aspect of things. And it's a long day when you really think about it, because you don't have those breakout sessions until afternoon, and those have a tendency to run a long time. And but overall, I thought it was a great experience.
And moving on to the Indiana side of things, obviously Curt Cignetti in attendance, along with Aiden Fisher, Justice Ellison, and Mike Kadick, for those being the players that came with Indiana. I think it's safe to say, Shannon, and you can disagree if you think so, but I think Curt Cignetti easily kind of stole the show, at least when it comes to the opening statement at his press conference. And me, I was super eager just to see him get behind a microphone, because for those who are already familiar with kind of the way that he rolls, he's not afraid to be behind a microphone, for one, and he's going to say exactly what's on his mind. I think he even said this in one of the breakout sessions, that with age, he's learned that he doesn't really have a filter anymore. And
Right.
he's going to say exactly what he thinks about things. And I think multiple times yesterday, he mentioned used the phrase ass kicking or kicking some ass. And he doesn't necessarily call out specific teams, but I think it's definitely unique and different, especially when you think about Indiana football, the type of attitude that you have coming from Cignetti specifically, and the expectations that are coming along with that attitude.
Yeah, I mean, he did, in some respects, steal the show on day 3 with not only his performance on the big stage behind the microphone, where he kind of alluded to the fact that he didn't particularly care for how the Hoosiers were rated in terms of the conference standings being second to last. He didn't like that. He did point out the last 2 times that happened, his teams went on to play in conference championships after being picked second to last. And then his unique comments out there, the 2 that I picked up on that I think that people really like to hear. I think one question was asking about that week 3 game going to the Rose Bowl, and what would it be like for, going to such a unique setup at UCLA, playing in the Rose Bowl, Pasadena, and all that stuff. And his comment was, hey, look, the way I look at it is we're going to an old stadium to kick some ass. And, and like you said, with no filter, he was not trying to lay shade to UCLA, and that the Rose Bowl was an old, decrepit stadium. His philosophy is, no matter where they're going to play, their main objective is to go win ball games, not for a business trip. And he made also another comment about, mediocrity. He sure as hell that 6-6 is not the benchmark that we're, shooting for. He said that's bullshit. We're shooting to be a team that is in the upper echelon of the Big Ten and ultimately win it. So,
and you meant real quick, while you mentioned the 6-6, I mentioned this the other day. I feel like if you're any of the teams in either the Big Ten or the SEC specifically, in this new era of football, and even before this year, if you're going 6-6, and even in some cases 7-5, that's definitely not even really the bare minimum anymore, because you have so many players that opt out of playing in those bowl games in favor of getting ready for their pro careers, because they don't want to get hurt in something that is essentially a glorified scrimmage. And I think nowadays these lower tier bowl games are more so seen as kind of a tryout for the new guard that will play in next year's season, instead of being a celebration of the current season for the players that are currently on the roster, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Now, one of the unique things this year that I think will keep most kids engaged is the fact that every team has a legitimate shot at being the top 12 teams in the country. I mean, the top, 24 teams in the country or so, or more. Because I think the first 4, the way they explain it, the first 4 champions of a conference get automatic bids, and they get a bye that first week. And then the rest that entertain that have that week 1 game on campuses throughout the country. So those teams that were before that got 2 losses in a conference, and theoretically the season was theoretically over because they weren't going to play for a conference championship. And the best thing they were playing for then was a New Year's bowl game, hopefully, if they could run the table or, get a 8-3 type of wins, games won. But this year, the possibility that you could get 4 teams in from the Big Ten or 5 teams in, I mean, there's no limit on how many teams can go into the playoffs from one conference. So that being said, those teams that have been in that middle of the pack or lower in some respects have a legitimate shot to maybe make it to the playoffs, depending on how they fall amongst the other teams in the country. So that will be the unique setting. But I agree with you, these bowl games now, and it's sad, where kids are opting out because they're going to the NFL and they're worried about catastrophic injuries. And I understand that. It's kind of, the bowl games aren't as what they were before when you're not seeing the top players play, and they're gonna have to redo some of the thought process on that, because now with NIL and revenue sharing, these kids that are stars on a team you're going to play in a bowl game. I mean,
there almost needs to be, and I'm sure you've heard this several times, there needs to be a cash incentive for each of the players to play in the bowl game, that type of a thing, because if not, you're going to continue to see more players drop out. And you may see players drop out regardless, especially if they're one of the top NFL prospects, not only on the team, but maybe in the country. So it'll be interesting to see if there are any changes with that.
Well, I think there's going to be something to that extent, or you're going to see kids with clauses that if you don't play in the bowl game or whatever, or, some kids may opt to not go in the playoffs. They're going to get hit with money that they're going to have to pay back, because that's not part of the deal. But that's all to be determined, because I still think we're waiting on this NCAA settlement that may not even be a settlement that's supposed to come out today from the court. So we'll see what all happens with that. But I think there's a little bit more excitement for teams now, that just because it's Penn State and Ohio State and Michigan that are playing for the top game, you're going to see a lot of teams that are going to have an opportunity to get themselves in the playoffs.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It'll be interesting to see which of those kind of middle tier conference teams get a shot at that down the road. I want to go back to Curt Cignetti one more time. One thing that does cross my mind now and again, I've talked a lot about his confidence and the way that he carries himself. And I do think that there is a potential negative response from fans depending on how things play out in the season, obviously, because like I mentioned earlier, he is simply by the way he talks, and he's actually shown it in the offseason with the recruits he's brought in, transfer portal, that type of stuff. He has already raised the bar without coaching a single game for this team. And so one thing that worries me is if the results don't come soon, the noise will quickly get loud, and people may even see him as kind of a clown type of a personality talking up all this game. And again, I'm not saying that's what's going to happen. And honestly, Curt Cignetti's probably not the type of guy who's going to care about all that noise. He probably trusts in his process more so than anything. But at the same time, I don't think it's fair or unfair to think that fans should expect even the most minimum of winning seasons. Like I said, 7-5, 6-6 with the bowl win potentially. Because, I mean, when you look at this guy's track record, he's never had a losing season. So again, he does have all of the stuff, the stats from his previous seasons to back up all the things he's saying. But again, along comes with that expectation. So it'll be interesting to see what happens if things maybe potentially don't get off to the start that he and fans hope to see.
Well, I mean, that is the risk that you take sometimes, that when you come out with bold predictions or statements, or, your filter's not as strong as it once was, and you kind of say things that get taken and, turned around on you. But I think he's the personality that he don't care. He don't care what you think about him if they don't win 6-7 games this year, because he's still going to have that personality. That's not going to change. I think Coach Cignetti is one of those guys that, I'm sure there's people out there that look at Coach Sig and say, I don't like his personality. They just, it rubs them wrong, or, however you may look at it. I think what people see and what they appreciate is the refreshed attitude, that he's not here just to be a 6-6 football coach. He's here to be a coach that can reproduce or replicate what he's done at other places. He understands that it's a different step. He understands that James Madison to the Big Ten is a big step, but it still hasn't, quashed how he wants to run a program or what his expectations are in terms of wins and losses. So I think I find that refreshing at sometimes, but I'm one of those things too now that, look, everything's been talked about. There's nothing more to talk about when it comes to Coach Sig, the recruiting, and all the things that have happened since December. It's now a time to step on a field and kind of see what we've got, because that's still the unknown. Black and white, we can all sit here all day ad nauseum and talk about this kid, that kid, and this kid. Until they produce on the field, it's irrelevant. So, and he related to that yesterday. He came out and said, look, the talking's over. It's now time to go out and produce, because this is a game in a business that you're expected to win. And it doesn't matter whether you're at USC or Indiana. The bottom line is you're here to win. And he understands that the talking's over.
One more question for you, Shannon, and if you don't have an answer to it, that's okay. But
okay,
just from what you've seen from the schedule, and again, we've never seen a lot of these guys play outside of the spring game. But if you had to put down a record on pen and paper, and you were predicting that to be the first record in year one for Curt Cignetti, what would you do today?
I've always said a good landing spot, 7-5. I think the biggest thing for them as a ball club is the emphasis on this first half of the season of them getting off to a great start with FIU and Western Illinois, and then of course UCLA. Though, that's going to be the barometer heading into the Northwestern game in Maryland. Those are the teams that Indiana has to beat in order for them to ascend to that middle of the pack mentality. Maryland did that last year. They won games that they normally didn't win, and they ascended. Now they had a great quarterback. Northwestern through the years, we're all marveled at what Fitzgerald did with Northwestern, and all he really did was he beat the teams that he really needed to beat. And then there were years where he had that one or two games where he knocked off a Michigan or a Penn State, and that can happen. So I think a good landing spot, 7-5, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're 8-4.
Yeah.
That wouldn't surprise me. I think after week 3, we'll have a better barometer of where this team is and where they could be.
It is weird that I feel like most people, especially when you think about the regular the good old days, and I say that sarcastically, of Indiana, people think 4-8, 5-7, 3-9. That's just kind of where it's always been. But the bar's been raised. People are saying, I'm with you. I'm thinking along the same lines of 7-5, 8-4. So that just goes to show that's where we are with the current state of Indiana football. But thanks again for joining me today, Shannon. I appreciate you, and I look forward to having you on again sometime.
All right, partner, anytime.
All right, that was Shannon Griffith from Hoosier Tailgate. Big thanks to him for taking some time out of his morning to chat some Big Ten football media days. Good stuff with him. Yeah, so we talked a lot of Cignetti there, talked a lot of Big Ten football, a lot of Indiana football expectations, and we're about a month away. We're about a month away, a little over a month, but we are finally getting close to the official start of college football season, a new era in college football. And I'll tell you what, even though I've only been doing this show for this week and moving on to next week, that kind of stuff, but I've been involved with this off season for the entirety of it, and I'm just ready to stop talking about it and I'm ready to see results. So, and I know that's exactly where Cignetti and the team and the staff are as well. So I'm excited about that. I want to go into some sound bites now, especially some of the I mentioned that Cignetti and a lot of the sound stuff that I've got from Big Ten Media Days. It is quite entertaining. One thing that Cignetti did say, one thing that's great about him, and there really is a lot of things, but he is fully aware that this isn't just a head coach. He realizes that this is the entertainment business. College football as a whole, really, I mean, it's the most popular sporting event for people to watch in America. And so, like, this is, and if you look at TV ratings and stuff like that, and it may be mind-boggling to some people, but the most watched live events on TV year in and year out nowadays is NFL games. And usually you have some college football games scattered around there as well, because there's not a lot of other things that people watch live on TV anymore. Most things that people consume when it's not a sporting event, it's stuff on streaming services, or maybe it's a live show that might be a network TV show, but you don't necessarily have to watch it during its appointed viewing time anymore, because once it's had its live moment on TV, it goes to its respective streaming service that it's a part of. And so, again, nerding out way too much on that type of stuff. So but I want to go and play. I want to go get in some of this sound. This first bit is from Cignetti's opening statement yesterday, and I'll react to it once I let it play. So here it is, Cignetti from his opening statement yesterday at Big Ten Football Media Days.
Now, I can tell you, normally at these things I stand up here and we're picked to win the league. It's just usually how it's been. I have been picked next to last twice, which we're picked 17th out of an 18-team league, and I get it. The 2 times we were picked next to last, in 2022 we won the conference championship, and in 2017 we inherited an 8-45 team and won 8 in a row and played JMU the last game of the year for the conference championship. Now, I'm not into making predictions. That's just a historical fact. Okay? So I know you guys have been waiting for me to say something crazy. That wasn't quite crazy.
Yeah, so he definitely feels disrespected, and rightfully so. There's probably not a single head coach in college football that could be leading the Indiana Hoosiers and not get picked to be near the bottom of the barrel. There may be like one exception, maybe 2, with someone like Nick Saban. Obviously now he's retired, or if Kirby Smart was for some reason the head coach of Indiana football, maybe those guys could manage to have their first year not be projected to be the bottom of the barrel. Because to be quite frank, the national media doesn't pay attention to Indiana football unless they're winning. And that's the same for any bottom tier college football program. They're going to pay attention to the Ohio States, to the Michigans, the Penn States, the USCs, the Oregons, Alabama, Georgia. I mean, most of the SEC, if we're being quite honest, because there is a college football bias towards that conference. And I'm not saying they haven't earned most of that, but there definitely is a heavy lean towards the SEC being the most dominant conference. And so when you get to the Indianas, the Rutgers, the Marylands, even like the Kentuckys in the SEC, you're not going to get the same respect from the guys who cover all of the sport that the big programs do. And so Cignetti obviously feels disrespected, but he's thinking about his track record. As we've mentioned before, time and again, he's never been anywhere as a head coach and had a losing season. And I'm sure if you're him, you don't plan on that starting right now. I mean, that's part of your legacy, and I'm sure something he wants to be able to say when he eventually retires, whenever that is. I'm sure he wants to be able to say he never had a losing season as a head coach, because there's not a lot of head coaches that can say that. So, and even that, when I was talking with Shannon, even if that bare minimum is what happens in his first season, you go 6-6 or maybe 7-5, and let's just say you're 6-6 and you win your bowl game and go 7-6. I mean, that at least keeps that legacy alive. But one thing he also talked about, and again, I just talked about this with Shannon as well, 6-6 doesn't cut it anymore in big time football. And I know a lot of Indiana fans, especially those who have been around a lot longer than I have. I'm only 26 years old. And so the sample size of what I've consumed is much smaller compared to people who have watched Indiana for 30 or 40 years. And many of you just want to see them get back to the postseason and be able to go to the postseason regularly. And I get it. I want that too. But there's not a lot of fun if in the season, if your only goal is to be 500. And so, and I'm sure, and it's more so from his perspective too. Like, he doesn't want to be a head coach and just be known for being mediocre, mediocrity, that type of a thing. He went on and said something about this the other day, too, in one of his roundtables, and I believe he said it during his presser as well. You don't raise your kids up to be 5th best or 10th best. You want them to be the absolute best they can be at whatever they aspire to do. Now, if they aren't, that doesn't mean that they're a failure. That's the other side of that. But you want to strive to be the best you can be. You don't come in to be the head coach at any place and say, well, the goal is to get to 6-6 because that's going to satisfy the fan base. You don't want to do that anywhere. So it's definitely a breath of fresh air to hear that type of stuff come out of Curt Cignetti's mouth. And not that guys like Tom Allen or Kevin Wilson didn't care about the program. I'm not saying that at all, because I think both of those guys did. And I was a big fan of Tom Allen. I didn't want him to fail. And no fan of any team wants their head coach to fail in any capacity. But it's definitely a different mentality with this new regime as opposed to what Indiana was experiencing with Tom Allen. The LEO culture was, it was booming for a while. When you had the 8-4 season, and then after that you had the 2020 year where things really, I don't want to say went off the rails for Indiana, because that's probably not the best verbiage. Fans were ecstatic. And of course, that's the year where fans couldn't be in attendance because of COVID, but people thought Tom Allen was taking Indiana to new heights. And he did for those 2 years. But there was no substance after the fact. And again, we'll see what happens. We'll see if Curt Cignetti is able to continue his winning ways with the Hoosiers. So yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and play another sound bite of his real quick and react to that, and we'll keep moving through here to keep things rolling. But here's one thing Curt Cignetti said at his roundtable. But you heard Shannon and I talking about him not being afraid to say that they want to kick teams' asses. Well, here's an example of one of those quotes.
We had a rival in the Sun Belt. They made Coastal Carolina a rival because, they were really catching fire and beating everybody, Jamie Chadwell and them. We beat their ass 47-7, 54-10.
You don't have a lot of coaches who just outright say those things. I feel like most of the time, especially at these media day type of events, they're going to give you the coach speak answer. And you also heard Shannon earlier say, and I wish I had pulled this one up, him mentioning, I think he was talking about the 6-6 stuff that I was mentioning earlier. He said that being the expectation is bullshit. And I feel like, again, nowadays you don't hear coaches say that. It's probably a lot more common nowadays, at least with the guys who are maybe getting up there and they've been around the game a lot longer. I actually believe Mike Loxley, Maryland's head coach, said that his bull crap gauge is on empty, something like that. So like there's a lot of these coaches, they don't want to mess around. And I do think the game has gotten a lot more serious too, especially now that you can pay the players. And it's almost like professional sports at the collegiate level. And really, if we're being honest, that's what it is. I mean, yeah, they go to school, they go to classes, and that's always going to be a part of it. This is college athletics, obviously. But they ultimately, as we mentioned earlier, this is the entertainment business. And that's their job, to entertain. The same way that the NFL's job is to entertain the fans. And they know they've got to put results together, and they want to do it in as flashy of a way as possible sometimes. Now, sometimes it'll be ugly. And they ultimately want to win each game, but they want to put on a show for the fans out there. So, yeah, Curt Cignetti, man, he's a character. And I will say, though, and I know I talked about this earlier too, and I'll keep going back to things I've said, but that's kind of where we're at right now. There is still a little doubt. And I think there's probably a lot of Indiana fans that experiences, especially on the football side of things, where I think people need to be at least a little patient in the early going. And I'm not saying that if he goes 4-8 that he shouldn't be held accountable, or if he has a disappointing season, because he absolutely should. But there's a lot of people, including myself, who have raised the bar on what Indiana can do in year one. And you heard us talking earlier about 7-5 kind of being that goal, and even further than that, maybe 8-4. And then there's even some people I've talked to that think it could be higher than that if things really swing in that favor. So if it doesn't go that way, I'd hope that most fans are patient, especially if, let's just say, they go down to UCLA, and we talk about that being the barometer game, the first true barometer game, and they put in a disappointing performance. You have to remember, that's only going to be week 3 for the entire season. So it's going to be far from a polished group of players and really a polished everything, because it'll still only be the 3rd full game with this entire coaching staff and players and all that type of stuff. So I do still think they should go down there and win that game. And I don't think that the coaching staff would disagree with that. And I'm sure many of them believe they can win every game. And I wouldn't go that far, just realistically, because it's going to take a lot. They're making a point. Here's the thing. You don't play Michigan or Ohio State, the big boys of the conference, until later on in the season. So it wouldn't be fair right now to even really judge whether or not Indiana may or may not be capable to take on one of those programs and potentially beat them. Now, obviously, history will tell you that won't be the case. Indiana hasn't beaten Ohio State since, I believe it was the 80s, the late 80s, something like that. Now, they did get Michigan a couple of years ago during the 2020 season. But that Ohio State monkey has been on the Hoosiers' back for quite some time. So we'll have to wait and see what happens. Again, it's hard to talk full expectations when we haven't seen anything other than the spring game and just what we've heard Curt Cignetti talk about. And here's one other thing that we don't know: the quarterback situation. We kind of have an idea of where it's going. He's been very complimentary of Curtis Rourke in all of the questions he's been asked about the quarterback position. He's also been very complimentary of Taven Jackson as well, the holdover from last season. But one thing Cignetti did say is that he's not the type of guy who likes to name a starter before the first game of the season. And so that, I guess fans have to continue to be okay with that, because that was the norm under Tom Allen. Tom Allen didn't like naming a starter. In fact, he would go as far as to say that they didn't know who it was. And that was probably a little bit of, just, I don't know if gamesmanship is the right word for that, but I believe they were just more so just trying to hide it. Whereas Cignetti is trying to be upfront. At least it sounds like he's trying to be upfront, just saying he probably has a starter in mind, but he doesn't want to reveal who that is. And again, he doesn't want to give his opposition a reason to prep ahead. And not that they won't prep ahead, but they'll have to prepare for multiple quarterbacks. And him being complimentary of both Rourke and Taven Jackson means that FIU in week 1 is going to have to prepare for both of those guys to potentially be the starter in that game. And if you remember back to the spring game, Taven Jackson put in a better performance overall than Curtis Rourke did. Now, Taven Jackson was throwing against the twos, whereas Curtis Rourke was throwing against the starters. So from that perspective, Rourke had much stiffer competition, and Rourke didn't have a bad game, obviously. But Taven Jackson definitely looked like he took a leap forward in year 2 of being under the Indiana football program. So it'll be interesting to see who they roll out there. I won't be disappointed either way. But I will say this: it would be probably a punch to the gut for Curtis Rourke if he transferred in as a 5th-year guy, and this being his final season, if he was not named a starter. And I do believe every player should have to earn it. Don't get me wrong. But if you're Curtis Rourke, I'm sure you're doing everything you can to make sure that you solidify being QB number 1. Whereas Taven Jackson, he still has 2 to 3 years left before his college career is all said and done. So it'll be intriguing to see what happens. I doubt we see a 2-quarterback system like Tom Allen and crew did at the beginning last year. I know that frustrated a lot of fans, including myself. I do think we'll see a definitive QB number one from day one, from game one. And if I were predicting, I believe just based on the way Cignetti's been talking about him, I think it'll be Curtis Rourke. And obviously we saw him being rolled out with the ones in the spring game. So unless there's an injury down the line, my guess is that it'll be Curtis Rourke going into week one against FIU. So, all right, we're going to move on from Curt Cignetti sounds, and I want to get into some of what the players had to say. And this first one, Mike Kadick, returning offensive lineman for Indiana. This is one thing he said on his appearance with Big Ten Network yesterday, and I thought it was pretty funny.
As embarrassing as it is, I was a ballerina, did gymnastics and figure skated. And then my dad was like, you know what? I've about had it with this. I'm going to sign you up for football. And the rest is history.
I mean, that is, first of all, shout out to him for not having a problem admitting that. Man, a ballerina, a gymnast, and a figure skater prior to being the big macho man football offensive lineman. And I'm not saying that he's the stereotypical like personality of somebody like that. He certainly doesn't sound like it. But to go from being in one of those sports, and I didn't even know the term ballerina could be applied to a male. Maybe it can. I'm just ignorant to it. But that's interesting. The father said, that's it. You're done doing these sports and you're going to be a football player. And like you said, the rest is history. So glad to have Mike Kadick on the so he'll be playing center for Indiana this year. I believe he was a guard position on the offensive line in previous seasons, but he'll be the guy under center. He'll be the guy responsible for making sure that no false starts take place, making sure the ball safely gets to the quarterback on the snap. And, it's an important position. So hopefully Mike Kadick can get the job done. He sounds like he is indeed ready to do so. But I'm going to move on to Aiden Fisher, the JMU transfer that Cignetti has spoken very highly of. And the few times I've heard him speak with the media, he definitely sounds like somebody who is more than likely the leader of the entire defense. And he's very comfortable talking about whatever it may be. And he's definitely confident in his ability to be the football player that he aspires to be. But here's what he spoke about when speaking with Big Ten Network yesterday.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Growing up, most of the time it's me, my mom, my two sisters. The reason I wear number 4 now, I lost my father at a young age. Had a great man that came in as my stepfather for a couple of years who was diagnosed with brain cancer. We lost him as well. But, I'm not looking for a pity story no matter where I go. I think the biggest thing is just, you're putting people's lives for a reason, in my opinion. Not only me, but those men in my life. They taught me some things that I've never thought that I'd be able to learn from people. And I think when you speak to my why, it's those men that were in my life as well as those girls at home that kind of look up to me. And, we share the same story, we share the same path. And I just think that's so important to me. And, being able to share that and have other people just know, like, there's always hope in something. You lose a lot of people along the way. There's a lot of stuff that, when you look at, you could feel sorry for yourself, but there's always a positive in something. And, as long as you keep going and you can get anywhere you want to be in life.
And that's clearly a guy who he's been through a lot of things that people his age have probably never had to experience. I mean, you lose your father at a young age, but you lose your stepfather as well as you grow up. And so you've lost 2 people who were probably very influential in his life. And him choosing to not let that affect him and to be able to move forward and kind of grow up. Because in those type of situations, you have to grow up fast. And obviously I can't say from experience that I've lost my fathers or anything like that. But it's definitely something that when you think about the rarity of something like that happening to someone, I mean, that can mess you up. And it sounds like he's chosen to kind of tackle it head on, no pun intended. But he's taking all that and trying to make the most of his life from it. And I don't want to speak too much more on it because obviously I don't know his entire story, but kudos to him on sharing that and also just kind of turning all that into being a leader for this team. And hopefully he'll end up being an instrumental part to this Indiana football team's potential success. And I'm looking forward to seeing what Aiden Fisher does for the Hoosiers this year. One more player was at Media Day yesterday. This is Justice Ellison, the transfer running back from Wake Forest. And one interesting tidbit for Indiana basketball fans. Justice Ellison actually knows former Indiana guard Xavier Johnson, and that was fairly instrumental in his decision to come to Indiana. So here's what he had to say about that.
When I got an offer from Indiana, that's the first person I contacted. I asked him, I said, man, what is Indiana about? And he just was like, man, there's a community that is desperate for wins. They want to win now. They want those actions to be, those words to be followed by actions. And, that's what I'm truly about. I think that I am somebody who, doesn't just follow the pack when things are going great, but I want to go somewhere where there hasn't been a lot of success. And he articulated it to me, and I was like, man, let me give an official visit. And I was like, I'm committing on the spot. So I was the first one.
There you go. Justice Ellison had that Indiana connection thanks to Xavier Johnson. And what do you know? Here he is suiting up as a Hoosier for Indiana football. And he had a great career at Wake Forest. I believe he was all ACC. And Indiana's running back room fairly loaded with guys like Tyson Lawton, the transfer from JMU, Kalon Black, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and a few other guys. So it's probably going to be a running back by committee. You may have a guy who ends up kind of being the guy at running back for Indiana, but don't be surprised if Justice Ellison is the first running back taking snaps this season for the Hoosiers. I'm looking forward to seeing what he does with his game. So that's all the main sound I've got from the Indiana perspective of things for you today. But as I alluded to earlier, I want to talk a little bit about Deshaun Foster, the head coach at UCLA, and his, again, I hate to call it a meltdown, but that's what it was. The moment was unfortunately just a little too big for him as he made his way to the podium to give his opening statement for Big Ten football media days. And, without further ado, I'll go ahead and play how it went down. It's only about 35 seconds long. There's going to be some dead space in there, some of that deafening silence, if you will. But it adds to what I'm going to talk about after the fact. But here's what happened when Deshaun Foster took the stage at Big Ten football media days.
I'm sure you guys don't know too much about UCLA, but our football program, but we're in LA. It's us and USC. We I'm just basically excited, really. That's it. Any questions?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's every time I've listened to that, it's still hard to listen to. It's also kind of funny, just because I've experienced something like that. And he clearly was not expecting something. Maybe he was unprepared. Maybe he was just so nervous because, after all, Deshaun Foster was not supposed to be the head coach coming into this season until the last few months when some changes were made. And so he kind of got thrust into this. But to go up there and kind of just bomb, and I hate to say it, but embarrass your program at your very first Big Ten football media day, it's honestly, it scares me just thinking about what he went through. Because I was watching the videos, I was playing that sound, and all I can think about is I'm sure he was just standing up there, and he probably had an idea of the direction he wanted to go. but he hit a roadblock and he couldn't get past whatever that mental roadblock was. And you could hear him getting uncomfortable, kind of doing that really uncomfortable laugh. He looked over to the side and, I want to go ahead and get into real quick, like how I can relate to them. During my final semester of college, I went to Western Kentucky University. I was taking a class it was one of my sport management classes. I think it might have been a PR related type of a class. I was supposed to give a presentation on, again, I don't really remember the topic, but there was a couple of us, I believe, that were in a group, if I'm not mistaken. And I get up to do my presentation on, the day that we're supposed to do it. And I get through the beginning of it just fine. I'd gotten to the point where I was comfortable enough to where I didn't really think I had to prepare as much, or I didn't maybe have to have my notes at the ready as much as I used to. And so I wanted to just kind of go up there and talk. That's what I like to do. That's what this is. I'm just kind of sitting here talking. I do have my notes in front of me, but I do like to just kind of sit here and let the conversation flow out of my mouth as need be. But I get up there, I get a few minutes in my presentation, and I get to a point. I don't remember if somebody looked at me funny or if there was something that got into my head that all of a sudden I totally forgot what I was saying, what I was supposed to say. I don't even remember, or I didn't even remember what I was talking about. I just hit one of those roadblocks where I didn't know where to go next. I was just staring there in the silence, looking at people, melting down in the exact same way that Deshaun Foster did in front of the Big Ten football media. And it was, without a doubt, the most embarrassing moment I had in college when it came to any sort of public speaking situation, which there wasn't a ton. I don't really consider radio or podcasting public speaking. People might think it is, but to me, it's a little different. But nonetheless, once so back to where I melted down. There was somebody up there, I guess it was a partner of the presentation, who finished it for me. And I remember I couldn't even look at them while they were finishing for me. I just kind of stood there with my head down, very uncomfortable. And we got through the presentation, and I immediately left the classroom after that. I didn't stick around to watch anybody else's. I was just done. I was embarrassed to the point because I was the radio guy, right? I took pride in being the guy who wasn't afraid to public speak as much as maybe the average person. I still don't like doing it. I would never volunteer to public speak in any situation if I was asked to, or if I had the opportunity or whatever. But taking pride in that and then completely bombing and failing, it does something to your ego. And I'm sure some of you have been there before in some way, shape, or form. But I went back to my dorm room, and that was, it took me a few days to get over that. My pride was hurt. And I'm sure Deshaun Foster at least felt similar. I didn't watch his entire press conference, so he picked himself up after that. I'm sure he did okay taking questions. And maybe that's what it is. Some people just do better when they're asked direct questions and answering that type of stuff instead of just talking off the cuff. So, again, I feel for Deshaun Foster. I do wish him the best. Obviously, I hope Indiana takes care of business when they go down to UCLA. And I'm sure hearing that made Indiana fans a little more confident, especially when you take the personality of Curt Cignetti versus somebody like Deshaun Foster. The confidence level is night and day different. And so we'll just leave it at that. So, again, I feel for him as a human being because I don't like to see anybody flounder under pressure like that specifically, because it can do something to you for a while. And again, like I said, I still remember that as being one of the more embarrassing moments for myself in college. And I'm sure this was one of the more embarrassing moments for him as a head coach. So, man, good stuff today. Well, let's see. Anything else you want to get into before we wrap this thing up? Here's a couple little news notes. I already talked about BT and tailgate coming in with against Maryland. One thing on the basketball side of stuff, Indiana will be playing Marion in an exhibition matchup before the season officially tips off in November. And for those of you who don't know, Pat Knight, he is now the head coach at Marion University. So you'll have one of the Knight members back in Assembly Hall. Obviously, he visited in the past. I believe he did whenever Bob Knight came back for whenever that game was. Whenever Archie Miller was still the head coach, that stuff. So I'm sure fans will be excited to have Pat Knight back in Assembly Hall. Also, this is something we may dive deeper into later on, but there's new scholarship numbers that the NCAA approved for future seasons moving forward, and that'll affect basketball and football specifically. I believe basketball's scholarship numbers are moving up to 15. And I got to say this real quick about it. I don't get how that makes sense. The amount that you had already seemed like too large of a number. I think it was 13, 12 or 13. And a lot of those guys on scholarship, they still don't play. At least they don't play significant minutes. And so adding to that number for basketball, I just don't see where it makes sense. You're like, oh, here's one thing. I will say this. It's good for the students, especially maybe if you're going to give some of those scholarships to just walk-ons instead. It's good for them just because it pays for their way to get into school. And I know they have NIL and all that kind of stuff now to help out. And usually those NIL collectives are associated with the teams as a whole, but it is good in that regard. But if you're going to take those scholarships and go out and get guys who may want to be major contributors, I don't see how you're going to find enough minutes for any of those guys. And so we can get into more of that down the road. And yeah, we'll talk more about that in the future. We'll also, next week, we're definitely going to get into some more basketball talk. I don't want to neglect Indiana basketball too much. I know that's the bread and butter of the Hoosiers athletic program, but it has been Big Ten football media days. That's why we've been very football heavy. And honestly, up until we get closer to basketball season, it is probably going to be football heavy in a lot of regards. And hopefully it's a good thing. Hopefully things are going well for the football program, and hopefully people are excited and, you know, ready to hear about football, because I sure love talking about it, especially once the season gets going. And hopefully they have a lot of success down the road. So that's going to do it for episode number 2 of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by Hoosier Illustrated. Hopefully you stuck around, and I appreciate those who are, you know, still giving me a chance. Hopefully I haven't let you down yet, because we're going to keep doing this. Remember to check it out on HoosierIllustrated.com and subscribe to the YouTube page, Hoosier Illustrated. Leave a like if you enjoyed this. Feel free to comment on underneath of the video as well. And if you have any questions, I wouldn't mind talking about any topics you may present to me as well through the YouTube comments, and so on and so forth. So that'll do it for this week. I look forward to doing this again next week with you guys, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. And, you know, we'll take you from there moving forward. And whatever else we have coming at you, we'll be sure to keep up. We'll keep you up to date with all of that as well. Thanks as always. Appreciate you guys. We will talk to you again on Monday.